Great, thank you, Tanvi. That was wonderful, a really magisterial overview of what is a terrific book. So I highly recommend this to everyone. It will be on sale afterwards. Tanvi will be signing copies. There's even a discount from the Brookings bookshop, so don't go to Amazon. You can get it right here. So I definitely recommend it to everyone. As somebody who, who comes from a more Atlanticist background and really feels pretty steeped in Cold War, history, but largely from sort of the Atlanticist perspective, I have to say I learned an enormous amount from this book, not just about the Cold War in Asia, but also sort of your central argument, which I found very provocative and interesting. And it's a very well-written book as well, so I think it's an easy sort of read for those of you who like a very gripping history, and there's some big personalities in it. And we're delighted to be joined by our friend Kirk Campbell here today, who of course has a very strong background himself in U.S. strategy toward Asia and toward India, and is involved in many of the recent developments over the last 20 years in terms of U.S. policy toward Asia. The architect, of course, of the pivot, and also has much experience dealing with India. So before, Tanvi, we maybe get into talking to you about more details of the book and looking ahead as well to the future of U.S.-India relations and U.S. strategy in Asia. Kurt, maybe we could start with you, but just your reflections on Tanvi's presentation and on the book.
First of all, Tom, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a terrific book, and grateful to be able to help celebrate this with Tanvi. And can I also say, it is true the way Suzanne began, the fact that Brookings is committed to research that ends up in books is an important, essential part of what scholarship is about, and I want to commend Brookings for doing it. I did notice Suzanne has a new long title, sort of acting special, sort of like one of those officials in Wuhan right now, so you're not sure how long they're going to be in that job, but still, I commend her on and congratulate her for this. So I really like the book. I will say, I told Tanvi as we began, I was completely unconvinced when I picked it up, because when I thought of it, and I thought of this period, I thought that the two mediating powers for at least U.S. policy in the region were primarily the former Soviet Union and Pakistan. I thought those were the driving forces of both American strategy and how India thought of the Cold War in Asia more generally. But I liked the breakdown in the book, and the historical dimensions, particularly the Eisenhower stuff, was fascinating. And the Tanvi's description of Eisenhower's historic visit to India, what it meant, and what animated American strategy in this period really illuminated for me things that I didn't understand or didn't appreciate as fully. I will tell you, as someone who has spoken and engaged with Indian friends, I think for a longer period of time, about China and about Asia, the history that Tanvi interprets for us, this history is much better known to Indian friends than it is to Americans. And it will be recited for you in great detail. Usually the areas of disillusionment and disappointment will come up again and again. And so I would recommend for friends who are thinking about the historical context and who are not persuaded necessarily. There is this view, and again, it starts at the beginning of the book. She talks about this idea, and it was represented by our friend Bob Blackwell, who was ambassador in India, the idea that there is an inevitable partnership that is will define the 21st century between the United States and India. But I think what the past suggests to us is that it's a much more complex frame, and that what India demands is not just that the United States has a nuanced and sophisticated understanding of China, but that the United States deals with India on its own merits. And I think at the core of running through much of Tanvi's discussion is not just the role that China plays in how the United States conceptualizes the Cold War, but when the United States stops thinking about India in its own right and mediates it through another country's lens, either the former Soviet Union or China, that's where we tend to run into problems. My problems with the book really, I like the fact that she's broken it down in these sort of segmented periods of hope and disillusionment. I'm not sure I buy it completely. I think the overarching picture, which I think we can look at over a 40 or 50-year period, is on both sides periods of hope that is almost always undercut by actions, misunderstandings on both sides. So it's raised expectations, disappointment, withdrawal, and what you see is a recurring pattern that takes place over 40 or 50 years that frankly continues today. And we see that again and again. It's also the case that even though this is interpreted as about Asia, I think the concept of Asia that we now think of more naturally was less common during this period. I think there was a sense that this was South Asia and not part of Asia. I don't think that American strategists thought of India as part of Asia more generally. I think we thought of it more as a subset of a strategy or set of interactions in South Asia. And I'd want Tanvi to talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that I'm less clear about, even though she talks a lot about in the period of the 50s and 60s and early 70s about China per se, I don't think there's as much of an understanding that in American strategy we tended to think of China and the former Soviet Union as a monolith, and that China's actions in many of these places were simply thought of as tests that for a larger strategy that it was being implemented by the Kremlin. And so I think in some respects that undercuts elements of her overall approach. However, the book is fascinating. Anyone who, I found what the most fascinating thing about working with Indian friends about China. Indian friends will tell you exactly what they want you to say about China. And then you will say it, and they will be like, I can't believe you said that. That's too upfront. That I don't want you to talk like that. And so the dynamism of how the issue of China plays in the Indian political imagination, that's the part of the book that I found most interesting and that I would recommend readers to think about going forward. So it's a tremendous piece. You're going to resist it at the outset, I will tell you. You'll start this by saying, I don't think this is right, but about halfway through you'll think, yep, there are parts of this that are really compelling.
Great, thank you. Tanvi, do you want to come back in on some of that, particularly just on the points Kurt was making about India as a subset of strategy and some of the details on the role the Soviets played?
I think one of the things the book tries to do, and it lays it up front, which is I'm not arguing that China was the only thing that mattered in U.S.-India relations. The good thing about being a historian is you're allowed to say there are multi-causal explanations. But what the book does say is that it's a pretty big missing factor that really hasn't been covered. And whether you're trying to understand kind of engagement or estrangement in the relationship, you can't understand it without actually thinking about how these two countries saw each other in the context of China in that period. So it is, and it looks at these other factors, including Pakistan and the Soviet Union. So it's called Fateful Triangle, but there are these kind of two other actors that, much like today, Pakistan and Russia, they do play a role, an intervening role, a kind of a role in shaping how this triangle played out, including in the context of the other thing you mentioned, which is the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. And I actually think what the book tries to do is lay out that one of the biggest sources of difference, at least in the initial phase that this book covers, is that the U.S. does see it as a monolith, the Soviet, the Sino-Soviet relationship as a monolith, and India does not. For Nehru, in fact, you could argue that he might have underestimated, and I do, that he underestimated the ideological kind of basis of that relationship and how much ideology actually factored into Chinese thinking at the time. He thought, mirror imaging, he said China is just like India. our major goals as Asian countries that have just come out of the yoke of kind of oppression from years of colonialism in India's case, but foreign influence and domination in China's, is that we will together kind of take over, or we will together kind of focus on developing at home and building a sense of nationalism. So he always thought this Sino-Soviet partnership and alliance was temporary, that it wasn't, that China will eventually split and eventually will come up into its own because nationalism will matter more than communism. Well, today we're debating that issue too, right? On China, Russia, and how sustainable that partnership is. And indeed, India is making the argument that the US and the West should reach out to Russia and wedge it away. 49, India was making the argument that the US should try to create a wedge between China and Russia. So I think there's a lot of awareness of that monolithic aspect. And you can argue that eventually Nehru was right. It's just it took a while for him to be right. The Sino-Soviet split doesn't happen for years, and that actually has deep repercussions for India, including in the context of the 1962 war, where the Soviets provide intelligence on India to the Chinese and also kind of hold back on supplying some military equipment that India had expected. And I'll finally just kind of comment on this point about Asia. I think it's actually a lesson for India today as well. It is kind of, one of the things that I found often very different when I came to the US 2 decades ago is that when people talked about Asia here, it was East Asia and Southeast Asia. You go to most other parts of the world, including Britain, Asia does include India. India considers itself an Asian country. But I think what the book tries to lay out is that in the first few years, India is considered or thought that the US policymakers think that India is an Asian country, had hoped for it to be more of an Asian country. But this starts to it's almost like that subset gets created, the relationship gets outsourced to the Brits, at least the first few years, when two things happen. One, the US actually disagrees with India's view of Asia, and particularly of China with it. So there's that sense that, well, it doesn't really match, so let's not think about it. The other thing is capability. India is very involved in a lot of Asian issues, the kind of Indo-China conflict and even the Vietnam War, the Korean War. It's actually a player in all these instances. The Afro-Asian Summit in 1955 in Bandung, bringing together people from what we'd call the Indo-Pacific. But what happens is its capability. It loses sight of what it should focus on, which is economic development and growth and building military capability. And I think that essentially, in some ways, doesn't just take India out of the Asian picture from the US perspective, but from the Indian perspective as well. India becomes much more insular and takes itself out of engagement with Asia writ large, particularly Southeast Asia and East Asia over time.
Thanks. Looking ahead a little bit, I'd like to pick up on a point that both you and Kurt sort of raised, and it's an interesting sort of theme of the book. And you write, U.S. India partnership is neither inevitable or impossible. And in your remarks, you talked about the conditions which you left unstated, but they are, just to briefly read out to people, there needs to be 5 elements, you say: an imminent threat, India's inability to deal with the challenge on its own, a willing partner, the lack of other partners, and sufficient political will and capacity to undertake a tilt. And I guess I'd like you both to come in, but Kurt, if I could start with you, what strikes me about those conditions is that all but one are basically not really to do with the United States, right? And so I guess my question is, when we talk about India here, there's an assumption that it's sort of entirely in the gift of U.S. strategy, right? If the U.S. has a smart strategy, it will get India on board. If it doesn't have a smart strategy, it will not. And does the U.S. actually have much less agency than we think in this? If there is a U.S.-India partnership, it will be because of external factors that have very little, maybe a little bit to do with Washington, but may need to do with other things. And how much strategic choice do we really have here?
So I like the 5 conditions that Tanvi laid out, but I actually think that there is another condition that perhaps is implicit in this, but maybe unspoken, but is actually more essential. I think what Indians demand that would override all of this is to be treated as a great power. And I think that the one issue that I think is generally the case through much of the history of U.S.-Indian relations is an Indian dissatisfaction with the level and intent of American engagement, that they see American engagement as episodic, not as sustained, not as commanding as the kind of engagement that we've had towards the former Soviet Union, Moscow, and China for 30 years. And I think there has been inevitable comparisons. The Indians in particular have looked at the intensity with which the United States has engaged China since 1979, and they compare their own diplomacy, and they find it lacking in some cases. And so I think that what's going to be necessary is a recognition that from the United States perspective, that India is not an occasional visitor. And we are focused right now on President Trump's upcoming visit to Delhi, but it has to be perpetual. It has to be a constant factor in American strategy, and it's not yet. And I think that's going to be the condition that's more important than these others. That India commands the level and extent of engagement that it is among the top tier, strategic partners and considerations for the United States. That's the first thing I would say, Tom, more generally. I do think that what India offers to the United States, even in the 1950s and 60s, is this combination of both being a developing country and a great power. And and I don't think the United States ever came to terms with the conjunction there. And I think the Indian dissatisfaction with the lack of engagement more generally has permeated most of the relationship overall. One of the other thing, Tom, I just say, and then turn to Tanvi. The other thing that was fascinating throughout early parts of the book is how much a sense of anxiety, almost defeatism, and a sense that we were playing defense, that we had to save India from falling into one camp or the other, animated much of American strategy. And it seems to me that we've made the most gains in U.S.-Indian relationship when there is an optimistic sense about the United States, not fatalistic, and not a sense that India is going to fall under some sway, or that we are losing in a global competition. And I don't think that is factored as much in these more recent calculations here.
Thanks, Tanvi.
I think I think the reason the kind of peak of the relationship in the period, the entire period that I covered, that it really, you do see convergence, is in that Eisenhower second term and kind of the early Kennedy years, where that's exactly what you see, which is a sense of optimism about India, and a sense that the U.S., it wasn't about stopping India from failing, but helping it succeed. What since kind of the Bush administration has essentially become U.S. policy once again, which is to support the rise of India. Kind of and these days nobody uses the C word, but the fact that both kind of the democracy and the power aspect are mentioned, that this is what makes India different, is that it is a democratic power that's developing, that it can show the democracy and development aren't mutually exclusive. Having said that, I think where Eisenhower eventually and Kennedy succeed is because they accept that because India is a democracy, the very thing that they were supporting, it will also be difficult and have an Indian independent view of its own interests and its own ideas about how to, for example, grow, how much to spend on issues. And I think this becomes kind of a running theme, which is this idea of independence, freedom of action, what often gets called non-alignment, but is essentially the search for to be able to make decisions on an independent basis, to be treated as a power in its own right. And I think where you see, so kind of the conditions you mentioned are really about when India tilts. Because I say, this idea that India does not align is not true. We've actually seen India tilt towards certain countries or blocs pretty significantly, at least twice in the past. But there are kind of things that the U.S. can do, because on China, where the two countries tended to disagree, was on the question of, do you engage it, do you contain it? How much force do you use? How much diplomacy do you deploy? Kind of, where does a country like Pakistan fit in? Should India kind of make up with Pakistan and then focus all its resources on China? Or as India sees it, do you actually see the China-Pakistan relationship as a problem in its own right? And then I think it comes back to this question of independence, because for India, the whole point about not joining an alliance, of kind of maintaining kind of a diversification, including a relationship with Russia today and the Soviet Union in the past, was this idea of not kind of having questions about the reliability of the US, but also trying to make the most of as many relationships and independently decide what path to follow. Because this whole idea of India never wanted to be in a situation again, which early leaders had faced, that before independence, India was taken into the Second World War without any Indians being asked about how the kind of millions that India contributed to the war, both in terms of men and material. And so I think, this idea of independence is very important, but there is a prescription for, I think, US policymakers and for Indian ones today if they want to make this partnership different. There are these differences on, Russia, on Pakistan, on engagement and when leaders, as Eisenhower and Kennedy did, showed and on their part, kind of Nehru and and they did it partly because they had no choice. They needed the US at that point. When they've shown either a willingness to bridge the gap or a tolerance of differences, that look, the other side, we're not going to bring them about. Because often this wasn't about misunderstanding. The two countries understood each other perfectly well. They just thought the other side was wrong. So figuring out, that's a view there, that's a view there. We're not going to try to kind of make the other person change their mind. We'll find a way to work on it. And then then you get the time to figure out those terms of alignment that I think we're, again, trying to figure out today.
Tom, can I say the other interesting thing about the book that from a bureaucratic reading, one of the fascinating things is the role that individuals play in this relationship. Like there are in our foreign policy, national security bureaucracy, there is not an Indianist group. There are a very small number of people that influence the nature of these debates. The role of the ambassador in many circumstances, both in Washington and Delhi, are central. And in each administration, the role of the leaders, and generally maybe only one or two advisors around them, play an outsized role. And so it reminds you that unlike certain relationships where you had like a huge cadre of people that studied that studied the Soviet Union, the Soviet specialists, that would animate administrations, and on China, the only group that has historically been most engaged with India that has been now, I think, roundly defeated, was actually led by the former leader here of Brookings, by Strobe and his team, that basically thought to view India through the prism of the non-proliferation regime. That group, more than any other group, thought of India in that lens. But more recently, it has only been a few individual players like Bob Blackwell, like Rich Firm and others, who have been able to animate the leadership around a country, a president or prime minister, to drive the direction of the country and the relationship.
So on that, I mean, you both talked about the need to, respect India as a great power and just sort of engage it on its terms. But I'm wondering what role domestic politics in India will play in the U.S. perception. I mean, we've seen a lot already this year, a concern about, Modi and various developments. That would seem obviously if that was a factor, to cut against that Indian sort of desire, to be treated equally from Delhi's point of view. So, is that going to be a factor in the years ahead, and how should we think about it as a strategy question?
So I think in kind of, this is something I think I kind of try to bring out in the book, in terms of there will be questions, I think already are, that if the reason that you are backing India is that it's not just a great power, because then, it will be a threat down the line too. Why, you'll have Chinese officials and kind of scholars say, why doesn't the US see India's rise as a threat? Well, for one, it's not kind of in the face of China's rise, it's not as big. But this idea of it being kind of not just about this strategic driver that is China, but that it is a democracy and that it is this kind of economically advantageous country to deal with. So I think the U.S.-India relationship has kind of this, I've always thought about it as a three-legged stool. Some think of it as a tripod. It's had a strategic driver, it's had an economic driver, and it's had a values-based driver on both sides of the relationship. And I think if there's a question here about not just, I think, about both the values a kind of leg of that relationship, but also the economic leg as kind of economic growth has slowed down a little bit. Same thing in India. If India has questioned, because the values-based side for India has also meant, things like immigration here, how safe its kind of citizens feel here, but also if the economy here becomes more economic kind of lens becomes more protectionist here. If those two legs suddenly start becoming kind of wobbly, you're putting a lot of dependence on that strategic relationship, that driver to kind of keep that relationship going. Now, having said that, in terms of if kind of constituencies here, that not just from the China angle, but the democracy angle and the economic angle, if they start, if they get disappointed, both in India's ability to play a contrasting role and an important role, but also kind of its, not just its kind of willingness, but its ability. So if these developments in India start affecting its ability to, whether that's grow economically and then spend on developing military capability, does India become so insular once again as it did in the kind of mid to late 60s that people just start losing interest? That here you might have people saying, we want India to play this role vis-a-vis China, but it's got too much going on either within India or it's got too kind of focused on Pakistan that it's not going to play this larger role in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific as we see it, or it doesn't have the ability to. So I think these developments could play a role. Having said that, I think one of the reasons you're seeing limited criticism of India, despite all the like concerns amongst some constituencies, is because of the China aspect, is because of the strategic aspect. Yeah. It is why partly, yes, President Trump might not care about some of the democracy and human rights issues, but others in the administration would under normal circumstances. I think one of the reasons you're seeing limited criticism, not just on the part of the US, but a number of other countries, is that India is still seen in a very kind of geopolitical sense as a potential balancer, an actual balancer to China.
Yeah, Tom, I agree with all that Tanvi said. I'd say if you're looking for areas to be anxious about in U.S.-India relations, I mean, so much of it has to do with how American politics plays out, but you could note a number of things that you could be worried about. I think at the top of the list is domestic politics, and it is interesting how few international groups have spoken out about concerns inside India, and I agree with Tanvi. I think part of it is uncertain to how much farther it's going to go, and I think worried that by commenting it could get worse. But also, I think the China aspect comes to play. But it doesn't stop there. The areas that I think we can be concerned about, I think India has a very different view about Iran than the United States does, and I think their partnership, their sense of working with Iran into the future could be in stark contrast to where the Trump administration wants to go. I think the enduring arms relationship with Russia, we've already seen some issues there. I think the bigger issue that we could see coming up is on trade. And I think the steps that Trump has taken with various countries that causes anxiety in terms of taking punitive actions. If he takes more of those in India, it could have really very significant political costs inside the country as a whole. And so it'll be interesting to see what the next couple of months will be like. I can imagine if a Democratic government comes to power, that issues associated with climate change, I think India has a very different conception about its historical responsibilities and what it needs to do going forward. I can imagine those issues also causing concerns. Overall, balancing that is this larger issue of China per se, But at the same time, I think that what India wants is a clear-headed American assessment. But I think they worry about extremes. They worry about both condominium and now I think they are probably a little concerned that the United States is veering too much in a direction of open conflict, which I think they would view as contrary to their own economic interests, because India, of course, wants to be able to partake in some aspects of Belt and Road and engagement with China as appropriate, while keeping its guard up in terms of its larger strategic concerns.
And is India's sort of concerns there different than the rest of the region? I mean, we often sort of comment on that, and the region being a bit anxious about sort of the dichotomous way the U.S. debate is often sort of framed, and in competition going too far. Is there something unique about India's concerns that would make it different from Japan or Australia in that regard?
I sat in a lot of the, India was brought into the East Asia Summit and to the ASEAN Regional Forum. It's still an uncomfortable mix, to be honest. I mean, I think India is still learning the cultural, kind of norms and what are the key issues that animate East Asia per se. I think the countries that have had the most luck in a nuanced discussion around China have in fact been Japan, Australia, and India, in which they talk carefully about a number of things, but never directly about the threat or the anxieties that all of them share with respect to China.
Can I just say on the kind of, it is interesting how India sees U.S.-China dynamics. And it really is that Goldilocks view. You want it to be just right, neither too warm, because that becomes a G2 if the U.S.-China feeling too kind of warm and fuzzy towards each other, but then kind of not wanting to see it too cold and icy, because that requires India to make choices it doesn't want to make, but also it decreases India's utility. And in that sense, I mean, one of the things you've seen is that Indian leaders, both current and in the past, which the book reflects, have often talked about how to use U.S.-China conflict or competition. And I think you're seeing it today, where you're seeing kind of India push itself forward in a way that it wouldn't have in the past, as saying it's willing to kind of take on more of a role, to join things like the Quad, to move forward with something. Kurt was present at the creation of the U.S. India Japan trilateral, and that which is also has a military dimension now. That India is doing it for its own good and for its own purposes vis-a-vis China, but also to kind of try to elicit benefits from the U.S., including access to more advanced technology, which it didn't have access to in the past. And so you are seeing kind of Indian policymakers do what they have done fairly consistently. And it is worth remembering that of all the Quad countries, India has actually had the most consistent view of China since the late 1950s, which is seeing it as a challenge alone and in conjunction with Pakistan. So I think it is also why they, in some ways, are happy that the Trump administration has taken a more forward-leaning approach towards, or at least a view of China as a challenge. They do disagree about the kind of approach, and particularly the trade war aspects of it, I suspect.
Tom, one of the things we have not discussed that's an interesting, we're really at the beginning stages of this, which is the activization of the Indian American diaspora in the larger political context. And really, President Trump has really energized this group. Now, historically, as a bloc, they have tended to be a little bit more on the Democratic side, but I'm not sure that's going to hold. We'll see how it plays out. But I think as a group, they have domestic concerns, but also I think are going to be increasingly interested in the nature of the relationship between the United States and India, and I would expect both parties will be more attentive to that going forward.
So just one thought, Tanvi, if we're relying on a Goldilocks approach, the U.S. and particularly the president, I don't think do that particularly well. It tends to be one end of the dial or the other, but hopefully. I guess I have one more question before we go to all of you for questions, and it's on President Trump's visit. I mean, his visits to any country, I think, are always very consequential because it places him at the center of the narrative. His team, I think, is less influential when he's on the road. He usually makes news, usually goes in directions you don't expect. He often sort of shapes policy. So beyond the general sort of strategic questions on the future of U.S.-India relations, what in particular can we expect from his trip? What worries you about it? What excites you about it? What are you sort of looking for? And how are those personal, dynamics between President Trump and Modi likely to unfold? Either of you can.
So I think President Trump will get a very warm welcome from the Indian government. And it is because of, now look, my book ends with saying it's unhealthy for the US and India relationship to depend so much on a strategic driver that is China. But I think a large reason why he will get a warm welcome is that India needs and wants the US to continue to stay committed to playing a balancing role in Asia, to be committed to help India build up its military capability. And so I think you are going to see, there isn't any other choice. India doesn't know what Russia is going to do with China. Yes, it's developing a relationship with Japan, with Australia, with France. But the US still is, for Indian strategy, for the Indian economy, for the people-to-people reasons, continues to be, if not the most important, at least a kind of first amongst equal partner for India. So I think you will see a welcome. I think the Indian Prime Minister, who himself is used to taking center stage, will be more than happy to give President Trump center stage. I think from the reports we're getting about whether it's people lining up in the streets to greet President Trump, or it is over 100,000 people in a stadium, part of that is recognizing what will go down well.
He'll call it 200,000.
200,000, yes. And it does recall actually a visit that took place 60 years ago with President Eisenhower. And I know you and Rich Verma put together an event especially on this in December. But this visit took place just as they had but there were deaths. They were shooting at the China-India border. The boundary dispute had kind of essentially become kinetic. And India needed support and welcomed Eisenhower. And there were, some people say, 1 million people that had been produced into the streets to show kind of an Indian welcome to President Eisenhower, who did get quite carried away in his subsequent statements. So I don't think India is any stranger to figuring out what it is that a leader would like to hear. I think we will see, because there's a recognition in India that India has not made large defense purchases from the US recently, while it has done so from the Russians and others and the French. We will see some defense deals announced. I think you'll see, I hesitate to call it a trade deal, maybe a trade package that will at least attempt to put this on ice for the next few months. And take it out of kind of the kind of concerns that I don't think they'll solve any of the big issues that have come up recently on that front. What concerns me in terms of how it might play out, I do think there'll be some trepidation about what President Trump might say, what he might do before or after vis-a-vis Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so I think that's the kind of thing. They probably wouldn't want a Trump speech to the 100,000 people saying, you got a great prime minister here. I've been encouraging him to also talk to my great friend Imran Khan, things like that. So I think there'll be some trepidation, but I do think the government at least, the government at least is going to try to ensure that it will do its best to make sure this visit goes off well. It is worth remembering President Trump has gone to India before, though not as president.
Yeah, I agree with everything Tanvi said there. I will say this, I can't think of any other leader who has had excellent relations with both President Obama and President Trump. Almost every leader in Europe and elsewhere have tended one direction or the other. And the fact that Modi has and his team have very effectively engaged to a degree that I think both leaders would say, no, he liked me best. So I think that's a real mark of the sophistication of Indian strategic diplomacy and understanding the personal dimension that Tanvi talked about. And I do think the Eisenhower, it's clear Eisenhower was in the midst of some domestic criticism. They rolled out the red carpet for him. And if you listen to some of his speeches, he was really overwhelmed by what he heard and what he saw in India. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a little bit of that in play. And I do think, there is one of the things that happens when other countries get together, I think privately, is that they share what works well in terms of Trump diplomacy. And, I think Prime Minister Abe is very close to Prime Minister Modi.
It's a WhatsApp group.
And it's pretty well known how to curry favor and how to get out of the doghouse on issues that are concerning. And I think we'll probably see some of that in play.
Great. Okay, we'll open it up. So just state your name and ask a question, which means your statement has to end with a question mark. So the gentleman here and then the woman down the back. Yeah, we'll take two together.
Mike's coming.
Yeah, Mike's coming as well.
Hi, Chris McRae. So my Scottish grandfather, Sir Kenneth Kemp, actually wrote up the legalese for India's independence, and after 20 years of working with Mahatma Gandhi. So I agree with your analysis up to 68. I'm really interested what you think actually happened in 68. Some people in Harvard tell me that actually the Chinese completely gave up on wanting to have to be so connected with Russia from 1968 onwards, because they'd realized 50 million people had starved to death buying nuclear weapons. So I'm interested in the 68 onward analysis and how you see that part of the relationship. Is there any more we can say on that?
Thanks. I'm going to take the woman down the back. Yes.
Tacy Schaefer, thank you, Tanvi. I want to underline something both Tanvi and Kurt said, which is the importance of India being treated like a great power and the importance of what they now call strategic autonomy as part of that package. But there was one dimension that I thought was missing, maybe it's in the book, and that is what the Chinese think about India. My limited experience when I was interviewing for the book Howie and I wrote is that the India watchers in China basically took a very superior attitude. Yes, the poor dears have been trying to become more of a great power, but they really aren't ready for prime time. What's your judgment over the years, but more importantly now?
Great. Two great questions. Tanvi, why don't we start with you, I guess, and then Kurt.
Sure. On 1968, I think the Sino-Soviet split comes before, and it comes, in fact, the U.S. and India, one of the things that policymakers do throughout is they talk a lot about these kind of global and regional issues, and they're constantly checking in with each other. They might disagree. What is the nature of the China-Soviet relationship? Because it has implications for both the U.S. and for India's interests. In 68, by kind of 68, the Sino-Soviet split has happened. And what that does, interestingly, it causes a difficulty in 67, 68, 69, in particular for India, that actually involves Pakistan, which is that because of the Sino-Soviet split, in the kind of mid to late 60s, you actually see not just kind of the U.S. trying to, and at that point had given up. By this point, the U.S. has given up trying to get India to make peace with Pakistan. This time it's the Soviets telling the other Indian partner, the Soviet Union, saying, we want to create a wedge between China and Pakistan because now the Soviets and the Chinese are in competition. And so this means that Moscow is actually encouraging India to make peace with Pakistan, and the Indians resent it. And what also happens is that Russians, then Soviet, they're much like today, started flirting with a military assistance relationship with Pakistan. So the Sino-Soviet split, yes, on the one hand, it's something that gets the Soviets to say to India, let's sign this treaty. Because 69 is when not only is there a split, there are clashes between the Chinese and the Soviets. That makes India, they want to keep India on side. And so they say, look, let's sign this treaty. India, for the strategic autonomy reason, Indira Gandhi refuses to sign that treaty for 2 years. She said, nope, it will mean that I will become too dependent on the Soviets. I want to stay independent. I want to continue to try to maintain a relationship with the US. But the Soviets put a lot of pressure because of that split. So it does have kind of an interesting dynamic where it makes the Indians both resentful of the Soviet relationship with Pakistan because of China, and also makes them more useful to the Soviets in some ways. I think Tezi's point about, Tezi, I do kind of, there are references in the book to kind of Chinese thinking, but this is, both the fact that the book would have been much longer than it is, and second, I don't have the linguistic skills to have been able to add the dimension of what China was, the Chinese were thinking and doing at that time. But there is kind of references to it in the book in the sense of, in the past, you actually saw in the beginning of the period discovered, the Chinese first kind of think of India much like the Soviets do, as kind of a running dog of imperialism and bourgeois lackeys of the US and UK. They think that India and the US will collude, especially on the subject of Tibet. But then they become convinced that India can actually be useful as it's trying to engage China, that India can help kind of unisolate China as everybody else was trying to do. But then, of course, things get very tense, and China actively starts to see India once again as potentially colluding with the US on the subject of Tibet. Things go really badly. And then once they defeat India in the war, it really do. I think that idea that India kind of goes out of the Chinese mindset saying it's not useful. In the 70s, you do see the Chinese wanting to engage India because they too don't want to see an India too dependent on the Soviet Union. And so they too asked the US to kind of broker some sort of kind of rapprochement between China and India. But largely, I think Susan Shirk's point of view that she's written about, that after that, for the longest time, China didn't really think about India very much. And today, I think there is a sense that India is, I think, especially over the last decade and a half, as India acquired nuclear weapons, as its economy started to grow, and particularly as it developed a relationship with the US and its allies and partners, that China is taking another look at India and actively either sometimes trying to create a wedge between the US and India, but also, on the other hand, trying to also see where it can push India when necessary, and basically try to expose the US in terms of whether or not it will come to India's assistance.
Tezi, to your general point, I really like the way Tanvi, I think for the longest time, what really pissed the Indians off is when you'd ask the Chinese, when you ask them, what do you think China thinks about you? And the truth is, they're not thinking that much about them. That really bothers the Indians. I think that's changed gradually. There's a civilizational dimension to it. There's a power dimension to it. But essentially, until quite recently, and the Chinese were quite, I think, effective at communicating, gee, we're not thinking about you that much. And that had an impact on how the Indians perceived the dynamic per se.
Great. Thanks. So we got a few more. So we'll take the gentleman here. These two gentlemen in this row, fourth row from the front. And then we'll come over here afterwards.
I think your ideas are very perceptive. We look at China, we look at India through the eyes of China is right. But there's a reason. Because to this very day, China is sending its people to be educated over here in our universities, in our places of higher learning. And so they go back. What are they doing? They're promoting trade all over the world. Look at Africa. And you see United States mirrored as it was years ago through the eyes of China. And so you are right. And I applaud you for your position, which I've never heard before. United States is the leader in the world, and China follows our lead.
thank you. Gentlemen on the row here, yes.
Sure. My name's Encore. So there seemed to be some uncertainty in the panel on how far Modi's hardline anti-Muslim policies would go. But assuming that they do follow the current trend and go much farther, and also assuming that inevitably at some point, whether it's next year or 5 years and 9 years from now, there will be an American administration with slightly different principles and outlook on the world. How far can those hardline policies in India go before that values leg of the tripod becomes untenable? Even assuming that a democratic administration has those same strategic priorities, how far can that go before the stool tumbles?
And there's two more right beside, so we'll just take those two together as well. So the gentleman and the woman beside.
My name's Elliot Hurwitz. I want to thank the panel for a very good presentation. I just want to look back to Mrs. Madan's comments on India seeking access to more advanced technologies. From whom? Those could be available from the PRC. They could be available from Russia. They could be available from the United States. They could be available from a lot of other places.
Great, thanks. And a woman beside you then, yes.
Thank you. I'm Jeanine Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for being here. I would like to bring back to the future, moving forward. Where do you see U.S., India, and China in the Southeast Asia, especially with the new landscape in the sea, in Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and also space and AI and technology? Thank you.
Great, thanks. There's a lot there, so you don't need to each address each one, but we'll try to cover maybe them all between us. So, Tanvi, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think that India seeking access to technology, India ideally wants to develop its own technology, its own capabilities, but it recognizes that it doesn't necessarily have the capability to do it independently, and so it wants to kind of get as much as possible from as many different partners. In the case of the Chinese, I mean, there's this debate going on right now. It's a different kind of technology. It's in this question of whether or not to let Huawei into kind of the 5G network. So yes, it's seeking some kind of technology from China, but not of the defense variety, for understandable reasons that India sees China as its main strategic competitor. And has had a pretty fraught relationship with it for kind of decades now. I think this aspect of seeking access, it comes out in the book. I mean, there's a long-running thing between the India and U.S. About what technology India can have access to. And I think it comes to this fundamental difference between how the U.S. and India see technology and trust. So in the U.S. case, and this how the U.S. is used to thinking about allies and adversaries, and India thinking about non-alignment, which is for the U.S. the idea is through these kind of alliances and partnerships, you build trust, and then we give you access to technology. For India, a country's willingness wants the technology first, and that helps build trust. That if for India, it's always been a sign that the U.S. not just unwillingness sometimes to provide technology to India, but sometimes in active cases to kind of sanction India or to prevent India from acquiring certain technologies was seen in India as one way of the U.S. actually preventing India's rise, of holding it back. So you are seeing, I think, this idea of access to technology, not just actually helping build capability, but I think it's changed mindsets in India about the U.S. Taking India seriously, about the U.S. trusting India, and it's now helping to build. Going back to something Kurt said, it's important not just for a few individuals within the strategic framework. It's important for the institutionalization of the relationship where it's more than one or two individuals. And I think that technology's aspect is helping, the fact that they've opened up is helping develop that in some ways. Very quickly on U.S., India, China, Southeast Asia, I'm going to let Kurt answer that, but we also have an event here on February 25th. I think that will look exactly at the question of how major powers are seeing China, and including in the context of Southeast Asia. I hope you'll attend that. I'll just go back to the question of kind of how sustainable is this. I think one thing that's important is to see both sides. That, I'm not saying the both sides is but just that I want to reflect that Indians have concerns about what's happening here too. And so this could happen on either side. So what I'm going to say, I think it does depend to some extent on China's behavior, because that I think will help to make both the US and India decide where that strategic stuff gets prioritized. You know, if China continues to behave in a manner that both sides see as assertive, I think you will see different people of different stripes. If something like climate change becomes far more relevant, then I think you might see a US India, China kind of conversation about there are these things where you can see the three countries actually agree on. And you'll see a US that is far more interested in engaging China, for example, in climate change. You could see a Bloomberg, for example, also say, I don't care about these issues with either the kind of democracy, human rights, with either China and India. But I think there's an aspect of it that might make it not just unsustainable from the US side. At some point, if a Modi government wants to take certain positions domestically and it decides that the US is asking too much of it or putting too much pressure, it will just say, go fly a kite. These are my priorities. And, you know, I will just, even if it means that, this is kind of an extreme scenario, that I will find a modus vivendi with China that you might not like. And if the Chinese are smart, they take the Indians up on it. You could also see the Indians actually say, look, the Chinese in some ways on the value side, we're both sovereignty hawks. We both think everybody should mind their own business. That you can actually find common cause with that. So I think you could play this out in many different directions. That's why I think the jury's still out on where this goes.
So my guess is the period ahead, in some respects, will be a golden age for middle powers. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people think that the dominant arenas of maneuver are by the United States and China. I'm not sure that's the case. I think what we're seeing are subtle plays by Japan, India, Australia, and a couple of others. And most of those countries are trying to figure out a balance between engagement between Washington and Beijing in a very subtle, complex way. And so if you look at the United States, we'd say, well, undeniably, our closest ally and friend in Asia, the country that's completely with us, is Japan. But if you're Japan, the country that you're really involved in a very interesting project with is China right now, in terms of the upcoming, if we don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus, but if at some point in the near future Xi Jinping visits Japan, will that relationship be stabilized? And the economic dimension is so important to both countries. So sophisticated leaders of middle players are learning how to balance, at least for the near term. For the long term, it's going to be hard, but how to play off, how to maneuver, how to maximize both the political relationship with the United States to be able to extract as much of the economic and political engagement from Beijing more generally. So my expectation will be, my guess is that President Trump will have a triumphant visit to Delhi. But remember, his primary interest is not about America's role in the world. His primary interest is about President Trump's reelection. It's how that will manifest in terms of his potential reelection in November. But I believe almost immediately after, Modi will pivot and then talk and engage a little bit more in terms of how to use that engagement effectively in his ongoing relationship with President Xi in China. And so my guess is that we will see more of that among the middle players, and that it shouldn't surprise us, and we should be attuned to it and play an effective role of coordinating. I don't think it necessarily hurts American interests either. I think it can actually play a mediating role in the relationship between the United States and China that could be ultimately stabilizing.
Thanks. We have time for maybe two really brief questions. So we'll take the gentleman up the front here, and then the lady down the back. Sorry, we just can take two. So why don't you come up the front, and this gentleman here? Yeah. And then we have about 3 minutes. So.
Thank you. I'll be brief. My name is Donald Camp. There's an alternate way of looking at U.S.-India relations. Maybe it's a little cynical, which is that Washington cares about India when there's a crisis. and that's true even today. So my question to Tanvi is, was our relationship with India more intense in the period you're covering here, or was China more part of the crisis mentality, the Sino-Indian War and the 65 and 71 war?
Thank you. And second one.
My name is Piper Campbell. You spoke briefly about the Quad. I'm curious what your comments would be about India's decision to withdraw from the RCEP negotiations just as they seemed to be concluding. And that really pulls them out of a major part of the institutions of Southeast Asia. I'm curious whether you see the Quad being enough to counterbalance that.
Great. Two great final questions. And we just have a couple of minutes left. So if you both like to address those or just closing remarks as well.
Kurt, do you want to go first? Or?
Why don't you go ahead?
Don, on the question, and Don and Catherine here are two of the kind of folks who have been India Valas, so they do exist in the system, especially in recent times. And I'm looking forward in my next book to actually coming and interviewing you both about the more recent years. I think one of the things I had expected, because that's the history we grew up with, that this China stuff mattered in the course of crises, and particularly in 1962, and even 1971. That look, China mattered when the U.S. had to pay attention. What I was actually surprised to find that it wasn't just this momentary phenomena, how consistently these people were thinking about. Sometimes they gave up on India, but both in the U.S. and India, this question of China keeps coming up. I didn't expect to find it, so I didn't go in there looking for it. But you do see this kind of, the one document that really lays this out to me is in 1957 in January. Go read the Eisenhower second term, the policy NSC, I think 5701, which lays out U.S. policy towards South Asia. And the fundamental assumption is China's a problem. We need to support India's rise to serve it. So I found it much more consistent. On the Quad and RCEP, I see this as kind of reflecting a little bit of a problem with how kind of the security and the economic relationships in Asia are playing out. I actually think the Quad shows Indian willingness. It's also reflected in U.S. India deep engagement on the defense and security side. That I think on the defense and security side, you're seeing a much more forward-leaning India willing to engage in the trilaterals, engage on the Quad. The Quad has not just stuck around, but it's deepened in the last few months. But that's kind of this defense security side. I think the RCEP thing reflects kind of the fact that India is not as forward-leaning on the economic side, and particularly the trade side. RCEP itself has major problems for India, which is that India largely sees it as a free trade agreement with China. And it has not said that it has said it will not sign it for now, but they've left the door open that if China makes certain commitments or concessions, give them more time, create certain exceptions, that India will kind of come back to the table. And there are a lot of other kind of members who want that. So I think RCEP does show that there's this kind of mixed engagement that India has in the region. I don't think it's sustainable for India to not take a more forward-leaning approach on the economic and trade side as everybody else is. But I think for domestic political reasons we're seeing, and for economic reasons, we've seen it take that very different approach.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I will say the Quad is an interesting dynamic, mostly about foreign policy and national security. What is clear to me more generally is that what India and other countries are looking to, even though they have deep concerns about American strategy and trade and economics, there is a sense in the region that although our ticket to the big game is our defense and security commitments and support, ultimately what they want from the United States is an open, optimistic trade and economic strategy, which is largely lacking and believed to be lacking in Asia, and that without it, it's going to be hard for the United States to be effective strategically in Asia going forward. And I think that that's clear in almost every economic engagement in the region by and large.
Great. Well, that brings us to a close. Tanvi, thank you for a really terrific presentation and for conversation. And Kurt, thank you so much for coming back here and to talk about the book and U.S.-India relations more generally. Tanvi will be signing copies of the book, which is on sale at just outside the door, right, I think?
Inside.
So just inside. So we'll ask you to let her get down there as quickly as possible rather than pigeonhole her on stage.
It's really good.
And do buy the book. And thank you all for coming. With that, we are adjourned.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.